Is endgame in sight for the Assad regime, with the U.S. and regional allies seeking to subvert diplomacy and the warning from Damascus it will use chemical weapons if faced with foreign intervention? It would appear the Syrian civil war is at a tipping point. To crosstalk Syria's possible endgame, I'm joined by Carl Sharo in London. He's a Middle East blogger. In Chicago, we have Stephen Lenman. He is a blogger and author. And in Los Angeles, we cross to Majid Rafizadeh. He is a policy analyst and an ambassador for the National Iranian American Council. All right, gentlemen, crosstalk rules in effect. That means you can jump in anytime you want. Carl, let me go to you first. Where do we go from here? Damascus says it has chemical weapons, and the U.S. and its regional allies have no interest in diplomacy anymore. Where do we go?
I think let's clarify one thing. All this talk about tipping point and an end game, I think, is very exaggerated.
Okay.
It all started with the explosion last week that killed several of a former and a current defense minister and security leaders. And that was basically a very high-quality operation. That was really a dramatic operation. But in terms of the real dynamics on the ground in Syria, they are not going to shift very much. And in fact, what we have seen, this is sort of given an impetus to the Syrian regime to try to retake Damascus. So I predict that this balance of kind of ebb and flow of the Syrian uprising will continue. There is no substantive kind of qualitative or quantitative change in the balance of power, but it seems that there's sort of this imagined momentum and a reawakened interest of the West now that the chemical weapons are mentioned is sort of might propel this external dynamic to change, which we need to focus on, because it's not directly linked to what's happening on the ground in Syria. I mean, it's been going on for 16 months. Why all of a sudden now the talk of chemical weapons becomes such a priority and securing them? This is the interesting angle we need to look at.
Okay, Carl, if I can just stay with you, you're saying the Lebanese situation, the 15-year civil war.
Not necessarily that long, but I think...
No, not in length, but in the type of conflict.
Yeah. In terms of the type of conflict, unfortunately, and I have to clarify, I'm with the aspirations for freedom of the Syrian people. But what I have warned against from the beginning is if there's no clear political leadership with a clear political message, ultimately, another dynamic will take over, which is the sectarian dynamic. And I've long said sort of this is not deterministic. This is not bound to happen. It's not fatalistic. But where is the politics? Why are people reluctant to join up from other communities in Syria with this uprising? And that political failure means that the sectarian dynamic will get enhanced, unfortunately.
It's very interesting. Majid, if I go to you in Los Angeles, it's a very interesting thing we just heard from Carl. I mean, is there a political agenda that can coalesce the people in Syria?
Well, I think we can say that the month of July was a turning point since the uprising started 16 months ago. You see the more improved performance and coordination by capabilities by the local opposition groups and the rebels in Syria. I think they're trying to concentrate on Damascus and Aleppo to send a message to the Syrian people, to coalesce the Syrian people that the regime is more vulnerable than it projects, and the regime cannot hold the stability. As you know, the Syrian regime, they have been citing the calmness in Damascus repeatedly to strengthen their argument that they enjoy support in Syria. But I think it's very hard for them to sustain that argument. And you see now a tactical shift in the strategies that the rebels are using in order to as you mentioned, to coalesce the Syrian people and to convince the silent middle class, especially in Damascus and Aleppo, to join them. Do you think
the different sectarian communities can get along? Because this radical Sunnis coming out of Saudi Arabia, we've seen this before, haven't we? Afghanistan?
Well, I think you're right. I mean, if different players try to take side with different parties in Syria and to try to secure their own national interests, you might see what you mentioned. It's like the civil war in Lebanon or Iraq or Afghanistan. But I think probably you also would see, as the violence increase in Syria, as more people being killed, probably you see different.
Stephen, if I can go to you,
Syrian people might come together.
If I can go to you, I mean, the outside forces that are involved in this civil war, and they're numerous here. Are they all on the same page, or are we just looking at maybe a Spanish civil war? We've already talked about Lebanon. How about Spain in the 1930s?
Well, Peter, let me say categorically, what's going on in Syria, I've written volumes on what's going on. There are times I write every single day on what's going on. This morning, before I came to the studio, I drafted a new article for tomorrow, and my title is Syria Threatens No One. Syria is a non-belligerent country. What's going on is not an uprising. It's not a revolution. It's not a civil war. The ICRC was paid $8 million by Washington to lie, as if their lie changed international law. International law did not change, and it's very clear and categorical. It says no nation may interfere in the internal affairs of another except in self-defense. Syria attacked no one. Syria threatens no one, doesn't threaten its neighbors, doesn't threaten Israel, doesn't threaten the West. What's going on in Syria since winter 2011 is Western generated violence for one purpose. Washington planned this years ago. General Wesley Clark, former NATO commander, wrote about it in his book, Winning Modern Wars. He visited the Pentagon right around the 9/11 period, and he was told by high officials in the Pentagon that Washington planned regime change in about half a dozen regional countries. Afghanistan, of course, Iraq, Libya, Syria.
Okay,
Iran,
Stephen, let me go to Carl
Sudan.
in London here. Stephen just mentioned all those countries. Has it ever worked out very well?
Can I just say something, though? I mean, I think Stephen is sort of getting himself a bit muddled and a bit confused. And we're seeing that amongst a lot of Western anti-imperialists, is this desire to oppose Western intervention is kind of pushing them in the direction of kind of distorting, if you like, what's happening on the ground, or a distorted understanding of what's happening in the ground. I think also the other problem is this appearance that the US has any clear sense of purpose or clarity in the Middle East has been completely shattered. And that's even more destructive, because the United States now in the Middle East, because it doesn't have a clear sense of purpose, is just very detrimental to stability. And this is what we need to focus on. So unfortunately, I mean, far from the US having a clear plan about how they direct the course of events, it's sort of persisting in this sustained level of meddling that has no sense of purpose and allowing its allies to do all sorts of things. But it doesn't have a clear idea, which is more devastating. That is likely to push all these conflicts around the Middle East into kind of a further kind of sustained periods of time, because the US simply it doesn't seem to be clear about how it establishes stability, how it establishes order, how even it protects its commercial interests.
Why should it be in the position to do that, Carl?
Well, this is kind of a historical analogy, because I think we have to shift in our understanding of kind of imperialism. It was clearer in the past, and actually it made our job easier because it was clearer. It was clearer for us to oppose it. Now, there's a level of incompetence and lack of foresight in Washington that's actually reflecting very badly on the situation on the ground. So you talk about how they exited from Iraq, leaving the country in a complete shambles and not taking responsibility for what they did before, and inviting Iran and Syria to come into Iraq and allow the new cabinet to be formed and all that kind of thing, only for them a year later to sort of turn against Syria, and suddenly it becomes the pariah state. So there's no sense of consistency, and this is what we need to pay attention to.
I think a lot of people think it is consistent. Let's go to Los Angeles. Majid, you wanted to jump in there. Go ahead.
Okay.
Yeah, if I can just add to what your guest said earlier, that Syria is not a danger to anybody and it's not a revolution. I just want to say some facts that this started with a localized movement in Daraa with some children first writing graffiti on wall and then being tortured, and then when their family went to police station, they told them that go and make new children and forget about these ones. And I mean,
well, Majid, then why isn't there a Western intervention into Bahrain then?
Well, I think Syria is a strategically important country. If any political change in Syria would reverberate across the region, I think we can't just go inside a country and change the head of states. And
well, that's what the U.S. has been doing for at least a decade. The U.S. has been doing that for at least a decade, if not longer.
Well, I just want to add a point personally. I mean, I mean, you can make an argument if Syria is a danger to other countries, but definitely it's danger for its own people. I personally lived in that country. I know the political separation in that country and what the people are going through now. And how if I can ask your guest, how can he explain the thousands of Syrian people who are being killed, their life being sacrificed? How can he say to them that this is not an uprising, and this is all like what the Syrian regime maintained the line. This is all conspirators and Western-backed terrorists.
Stephen, you want to jump in there before we go to the break?
Oh, it absolutely. It absolutely is Western-backed. And America, Carl, America has a very clear purpose in what it's doing. And again, this was planned many, many years ago. The purpose is regime change. America tolerates no independent regimes. All of the countries that America goes to war against and the ones it plans to go to war against are independent governments that are not one-sidedly.
All right, Stephen, I have to jump in here. Gentlemen, we're going to go to a short break, and after that short break, we'll continue our discussion on Syria. Stay with RT. Welcome back to Crosstalk. I'm Peter Lavelle. To remind you, we're talking about the Syrian civil war. If I go back to you, Carl, in London, many in Western media and politicians are talking about an end game in Syria. What is that end? I mean, Assad goes and everyone lives happily ever after? I mean, what does the end mean?
Well, that's the real problem. It's the question. I mean, in my next column I'm writing is, what is an end game in Syria? How do you define that? Because they're making mistaken analogies with places like Egypt and Tunisia, where you can just sideline the president and then kind of the system can continue in a different way. In Syria, it's a radically different situation. If Bashar al-Assad leaves tomorrow, another person will step in. There's a much wider circle that has this power interest. So ultimately, even if you're talking about the higher echelons of the regime actually leaving, you're going to have to arrive at a political kind of solution that allows that transition to happen and allows like the Alawi community, the Christian minorities, all of these people not to feel threatened by whatever is coming. So that idea that we'll keep the pressure and then one day Bashar al-Assad will just leave, that's not going to happen in Syria. There's a much more different power structure in there. And what we really need to look at is what is the political solution. And here's the failure of what has become the de facto political representative of the Syrian uprising, the Syrian National Council, which is an utter failure. It doesn't have any command of any power on the ground, doesn't have any political authority, and doesn't have any imagination to come up with a solution or even offer any kind of transitional plan. So even if we're talking about military successes on the ground for the uprising, that's actually even more dangerous in absence of a form of political control that knows what it's aiming for. So I fear that's kind of a very bleak picture, and this talk of an end game is a bit of a hype at the moment without that political clarity.
Majid, if I can go to you in Los Angeles, if Assad were to suddenly go, would you worry about a bloodbath, ethnic cleansing?
Well, I think we need a peaceful transition.
Well, no
to
one
a more
seems
democratic system of
well,
governance.
a civil war,
but
you don't usually get a peaceful transition. We're in a civil war.
Well, I think Well, I think what is going to happen for weeks and months to come, I think the basic stalemate that we're witnessing now, it's going to continue. I think neither the opposition or local oppositional groups, the rebels or the government, can win this battle. There's an international stalemate, and I think this will continue for the months to come. And many, probably more young people will become radicalized. They will see their relatives being killed, and they may take more guns and to defend themselves. And you would see also the government using more force to quell these rebellion. So I think this remains to be seen how the transition is going to work.
Well, Majid, if I can stay with you in Los Angeles, does this bode well for a democratic future?
Well, I think if Assad, I think if he now allows a more, as I mentioned, a peaceful transition, you might see, you might see different groups coming together, and now the secular, the Muslim Brotherhood, all different groups has to come together and create a pluralistic society. But I don't see that to be happening soon.
Okay, Stephen, if I can go to you. It's very interesting, the Assad regime said they have chemical weapons. Do you think that's going to make the West hesitate a little bit, NATO? Because we keep hearing something must be done.
Well, the West brought up the subject. Well, this is all hype, Peter. This is hype. And the West brought up the subject of chemical weapons. A lot of countries have chemical weapons. I deplore them. Biological weapons, nuclear weapons. There is no country with a greater arsenal of weapons of mass destruction in the region than Israel. It's well known, it's acknowledged. They have a huge stockpile of nuclear weapons, delivery systems that can send them far distant from Israel. They have chemical weapons, and they use them, Peter. They've used them in Lebanon. They've used biological weapons. They use them against the Palestinians in Gaza, in Cast Lead. And doctors have treated the injured and the dead, and they've seen injuries they never saw before from the weapons that Israel uses, and Israel tests new weapons in its wars. Where's the condemnation of Israel? Where is the condemnation? Where's the condemnation of the occupation? It's a very distorted picture, and how this ends, I have no idea. But it could end if Washington called off its dogs. But once you unleash them, it's not so simple. And I must tell you, I just learned about this, and I don't know very much about it, and I can't substantiate it, but I've heard stories that these so-called rebels that are being enlisted from regional countries, they're mostly coming in from outside, not inside. They're being told that they're going into Syria to fight Israeli forces, not Syrian forces. Can you imagine that? Why would one Arab want to go to war with another Arab? But you tell them that Israel has got its army in Syria, and these people think they're going on a mission to liberate Syria from Israel.
Well, it's interesting.
That's a powerful
I'd like to go to Carl.
motivation for
Israel's
them to
been
want to
mentioned
fight.
here. We hear the Israeli government is prepared to intervene in Syria. What do you think about that?
Well, I think, again, you look at Israel today, and it's kind of a similar symptoms to what happening with the U.S., but much more exaggerated in that it can only see the world through this very paranoid, security-obsessed perspective. And it was quite interesting that when they asked Ehud Barak and Shimon Peres about the theoretical possibility of some Syrian refugees escaping to Israel, and they said, absolutely not, we're not going to receive them, which is a kind of a very telling situation. They've been selling us all this empty talk for months about how sympathetic to the Syrian people they are. But of course, it's empty rhetoric. And now they sort of found a hook, them and the American, that there's a hook to the American crisis. And this is why I say we have to be very attentive to this level of meddling that's kind of completely irrational almost. Once they found the security hook, the same story of WMD that we heard with Saddam Hussein before, they're not deterred. Suddenly, they're sort of interested. There's an angle in it for us. And it's done out of complete paranoia. So I think for both countries, but particularly for the States, because it's the one that drives the policies, I disagree completely with Stephen. They didn't unleash this power. In fact, there's lots of debate in Washington now and lots of reluctance to supply weapons because they know it might end up in the hands of Al-Qaeda. But at the same time, this level of persistent meddling and allowing their allies to meddle consistently and kind of fueling the fire in Syria is very, very destructive. And adding this component of the chemical weapons is only going to muddy the picture. The big picture now is the Syrian people should be allowed to decide their fate for themselves. We don't have direct military intervention, but we have all sorts of destructive foreign meddling that needs to stop, and Syria shouldn't be treated as a kind of a regional international playground for all these players to settle their scores.
Majid, if I can go to you in Los Angeles, the chemical weapons, you think that could be a hook for the U.S. and Israel to strike Syria?
Well, just let me say, I think we are missing the point by focusing, by shifting the conversation more on Israel and the United States. I think if they wanted to change the regime in Syria, and if they, I mean, you would think that that would be the best scenario for them, just to change the regime in Syria, because then it will separate Syria from Iran, and that will weaken Iran in the region too. Syria, the closest ally in Iran, but they haven't done so, and for the 16 months they tried, in my judgment, they tried to wait for international consensus, and they haven't used really any unilateral or aggressive methods. And I think we should more focus on what is going in Syria.
Don't you think that the regional allies like Saudi Arabia and Qatar, they're the surrogates for the U.S.?
No, well, I think every country in the region wants to secure its own national interests. You have Iran, Saudi Arabia, there is the Shia-Sunni confrontation, there is the influence of Iran in the region, and there is Hezbollah. All these are the intricate relationship, I think, play a role, but I don't think that it's the way you characterize it, that they are some sort of playing in the hand of the United States or Russia, or Israel directly.
Carl in London, you want to jump in? Go ahead.
Yeah, because I think that's a very important angle. I think since the beginning from Tunisia and Egypt, the beginning of the Arab uprising, we've seen that Saudi Arabia and Qatar have actually kind of broken free from this American region order, so to speak, which has completely collapsed. And we can see very clearly the declining U.S. influence over here and the lack of clarity about how to restore it, which is kind of breeding, this competition between Qatar and Saudi Arabia. And again, both of those countries kind of meddling more aggressively in the affairs of other countries. I mean, just mention the example of Bahrain, where Saudi Arabia sent its troops over there without any Western condemnation. And that's a very clear example of the type of activity that we're seeing. And that's, again, contributing to this further region instability, because you don't even have that sort of American common factor that used to orchestrate regional policy. You have independent competing powers now, even, you know, between Saudi Arabia and Qatar, which is very, very destabilizing for the region.
Okay, Stephen, if I can go to you.
Oh, I fundamentally
go ahead,
disagree with that.
Jump in.
I fundamentally disagree with that. Qatar and Saudi Arabia are working closely with Western countries. Saudi Arabia has the deep pockets. They're doing a lot of funding. Qatar has got a lot of money as well. But they are actively working with Britain, with Washington, with France. Israel is involved. Jordan is involved. They haven't broken away. They're partners in this enterprise. Can I bring in one very important thing? To talk about transition in Syria. Does anybody remember that I think around March, there was a new constitution written for the Syrian people? It was presented in a national referendum, and Syrians overwhelmingly voted to pass that constitution. I read it. I wrote about it. Not perfect, but really a wonderful constitution, a democratic constitution. In May, Syria had its first ever free, open, and fair, internationally monitored parliamentary election. It shamed some of the ones that go on in the West. And again, I mean, this was a wonderful achievement. Transition.
Okay, on that note there, gentlemen, interesting discussion here, but we've run out of time. Many thanks today to my guests in London, Chicago, and in Los Angeles. And thanks to our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time, and remember, crosstalk rules.